Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard. I'm a shoutcaster for Legends of Runeterra, and while I will not be on the World Championship broadcast this year, I did still want to talk about some power rankings that I did for the 16 players that will be competing. Now, last year I pulled like 7 or so casters together, got all of their power rankings, kind of averaged it out, and it was a bit of a mess. Not many people knew much about the APAC casters. Yamato was averaging at like 14th or 15th, Alan somewhere around like 9th or 10th, so it is important to remember that like this is not really indicative of who's going to win or anything like that, and there are maybe some hot takes on here. It's hard to say what is and isn't a hot take because I haven't seen anyone else's power rankings, but I'm very intimately familiar with the scene, and because I covered all 3 WCQ broadcasts, I've at least gotten to see all of these players play pretty recently. Now, I have the players' names, the region that they're representing, as well as how they qualified for the World Championship qualifiers in the first place, and their lineup, as I will be talking about some of these points as I go over the power rankings for each individual player. Again, this is just me, my own personal list, so let's go ahead and get into it. And, of course, at the end of the video, I will be talking about the group stage breakdown and who I am predicting to get out of each group. I know there's some debate about, like, some discrepancies on some lists between whether Grandpa Roji or What Am I are in Group B or D, so I'll just go ahead and throw out predictions based on both outcomes. So that's what we're doing today. So to get right into it, let's talk about the lowest player on the power rankings. I have Kaiser. Now, I didn't just throw all of APAC at the bottom of the list. I promise I have a good reason. So Kaiser was about 3 players down on the waitlist for the seasonal points because he did qualify through seasonal points. He had 41 of them. And there were already additional spots given to seasonal point earners because Aurora and Pinpingho had doubled up on their top 4s over the season. So if there had been no double ups in the top 4, Kaiser would have been 5 down on the waitlist. And he only had 41 seasonal points over the course of the 3 seasonals because a Curious Journey didn't count for seasonal points. Now, you get 1 point per game win, so Kaiser picked up 41 game wins over the 3 seasonals, which averages out to about 13.5 game wins per seasonal. Now, if you go 7-2 each seasonal and you don't win any of the games in the matches that you lose, then you will average 14 instead of this 13.6. So I don't have the one sort of gap in my knowledge here is I don't know if Kaiser actually did manage to top a seasonal. If he did, he probably immediately fell out in the top 32, but I'm going to operate under the assumption that he did not because Donut, also a seasonal point earner from the Americas, had more points and did not have a seasonal top. So it is in the realm of possibility that Kaiser just didn't top a seasonal, didn't even really maintain a 7-2 record, and that's even assuming that he didn't pick up any wins in the matches that he lost. I think that he could have had as bad as like a 5-4 record, or maybe even 1-4-5 slip in there if he was picking up enough losses in the matches, and then, or enough wins in his match losses rather. And then looking at the lineup out of Kaiser, we're not seeing anything super impressive. I think Feel the Russian Conservatory were fine meta reads, but going into a more open meta, there are just too many unknowns when it comes to Kaiser. There's not enough sort of pedigree when it comes to this player in terms of proving themselves in these more open metas, and ultimately someone's got to be bottom of the list, and I think that 41 seasonal points being how you even qualified for the WCQ, there's really not a lot of debate in my mind on where Kaiser's going to end up on the list. Most players I think can move up or down about a spot, but that's really where I think Kaiser has to end up in a lot of power rankings, going to be 15th or 16th, just being so far down on the wait list, kind of getting in at the last minute. And yeah, I think that they made some good choices as far as the deck composition goes, but we didn't really see any like incredibly impressive play or anything that's really going to shoot this player beyond the stature of which they are coming into this. Coming in right above Kaiser at number 15, we have Donut from the Americas. Coming in off seasonal points, as I mentioned, Donut, right above Kaiser in seasonal points, had 45, which means an average of about 15 game wins per seasonal. Now, this breaks down to, on average, going 7-2 and picking up 1 game win in your 2 match losses, which isn't a bad record, but I'm really down on sort of the seasonal point qualifiers for this year in particular because the Curious Journey seasonal didn't count. It really kind of threw things for a loop because Donut has no seasonal tops, and I know that one for a fact, which does raise questions about the sort of the integrity of this system. He was dead last. Granted, he wasn't waitlisted like Kaiser was, but I think that if you're going to do power rankings, Donut and Kaiser really kind of have to be in the conversation for being 15th and 16th. Maybe you could swap them if you want to, but I really think these are sort of pedigree-wise the bottom 2 players coming in. And then when we look at the lineup that Donut used, I know a little bit more about Donut personally than I do Kaiser, so I can speak to this a little bit more. But from my understanding, when the Dark and Harp was revealed, Donut went, wow, that looks really good for like what Vayne wants to be doing. Talked about maybe this Vayne PNZ deck, like took a step away from Runeterra for like a week or so, came back, and then Vayne PNZ was everywhere. And it was like kind of a struck gold moment, and I'm not sure how replicatable that is. You know, Donut's not topping the ranked ladder constantly, so it's not like they're proven in coming into these open environments, finding the sauce and running with it. It might have just been a stroke of luck that the Vayne PNZ was something that stuck out to this player. And I also know that Donut plays in the Aegis Esports League, and I'm more tuned into Donut's team specifically than nearly any other because he actually plays with my older brother, and I know that I really hate pretty much all of the deck choices coming out of that team when it comes into Aegis, and I assume that that's who Donut's going to be using as this prep group. They are overthinkers to the death of them, and coming into a more open environment, they have a high chance to just get things wickedly wrong. And maybe Donut just does play the solid decks. That's what he did in the qualifiers. Ultimately, I'm not looking for anything crazy out of Donut when it comes to tech choices coming into the deck lineup, and I think he's just going to be a little bit too targetable when players come in and they say, hey, you know, this is kind of the meta that we settled on. This is what we think everyone's going to be bringing. I think Donut's going to fit really nicely in that box for the other players to pick on if they do find some anti-meta choices, whereas Donut not really going to be able to fight through that, just because we don't have a history of this player being able to do that. And with, you know, how stacked this lineup is of players, just not topping a seasonal and qualifying off seasonal points is probably one of the worst ways that you could have come into this. So yeah, I'm a little bit down on Donut, and he'll probably DM me about that. Coming in at number 14, we have the other player from Vietnam. We have Kicker A. Now, Kicker A was a lot higher up on the seasonal point list, but here's something I want to throw out here. So APAC, Kicker A was like 15th or something, but going all the way up to Chenia, who also qualified on seasonal points. Chenia only had 45 points, but was 13th on the APAC ladder, while Donut had 45 points and was like 24th on the Americas ladder. So overall, there were just a lot lower seasonal point totals coming out of the APAC region. But one of the bigger things about Kicker A is this is sort of the player that I know the absolute least about off of this entire list. Now, Kicker A played triple aggro coming into the qualifiers, and they played it, you know, well enough. There weren't really any moments through the qualifiers where Kicker A got to show off some impressive aggro play. Everything was rather straightforward. It was a lot of discard aggro that we saw actually slip through the ban phase and that they were able to play. So yeah, Kicker A is a little bit of an unknown factor to me. I don't know if they are known for the aggro, but going based off of just what I saw in the qualifiers, you know, it could just be, I have to play aggro. That's really my only option, which I think could do fine. Now, it is weird that, like, Elusives was the one deck that's taking a nerf coming into the World Championship. If you didn't see that, there is one balance change happening with the release of the Darken expansion that these players will be playing with, and that is that Sudden Surge now only grows a unit to a 4/4 instead of a 5/5. So there really is a question for me on whether or not Kicker A is an aggro one trick, or if they are able to, this was just a meta read and they're going to be able to come out with some new stuff come the expansion. But ultimately, again, just very low on seasonal points, lower than Donut even. But the fact that they were able to at least show a little bit of flexibility in the discard aggro. Donut, I don't think I've ever heard of playing anything other than sort of these more mid-rangey decks. Granted, Seraphine SI is in here, so you really can kind of read that one how you want to. I don't know if this really plays like a traditional control deck. Like, I don't know if Donut playing Seraphine SI translates into them playing something like Heimer Jace. But Kicker A, you know, if they're locked into just aggro, that is something that might even be an upside for them. You know, you don't have to think too hard about this new expansion. You just say, yeah, I'll run back the aggro. And we're not in solved meta like we were for the last World Championship, where Pin Ping Ho, who I thought was one of the strongest players in the world, came in, like, into their lineup with, like, pirates and stuff in this, like, Sparklefly Nami meta, the Draven Scion meta, things that were just very well equipped to deal with aggro. So Kicker A, just again, a player that I don't know very much about, so yeah, they are going to be a little bit lower down on here. Their seasonal points not impressing me, their lineup and their play not impressing me, but it could have just been that they were not put in a spot to impress me. Again, if I only get to watch 2 matches from this player for the entire year, then they might not have been in a situation where they could do it. But, you know, they did qualify through 5th place, I might add. They were the one that had to qualify through the absolute last spot, so yeah, I think it's pretty fair to put them this low. But yeah, maybe the APAC casters have a little bit more to say about Kicker A. Again, probably didn't top a seasonal if you only have 43 seasonal points, so there's probably not a lot of footage of this player running around at all. But again, let's move on from here, because again, I've already kind of said my piece. Coming in at number 13, we have my first EMEA player and possibly one of many hot takes, Smooth Swallowist. So I'm going to show the clip while I talk about this, but keep in mind that I'm going off of memory. I haven't gone and found the clip yet. But there was a point in the WCQ where Smooth was getting attacked for lethal and had a guaranteed way to live at 1 with a Hextech Transmogulator. Now, if I remember correctly, their opponent was playing a deck that had a little bit of reach, might have been able to finish off Smooth at 1. But instead of going for the guaranteed safe play, Smooth goes for a Stuttering Song Spinner and is able to find Steel Tempest, if I remember right, in order to live and go ahead to turn around the game from there. I believe like having a timely top deck of a Pursuit of Perfection as well. And really what it comes down to with Smooth being so low on the list, it's a couple of factors. Number one is the fact that Smooth came in off of ranked points. I've already talked about how the seasonal point totals were so low and unimpressive with players, you know, getting into even the top half of their country or region rather without ever topping a seasonal. So the fact that you came in off ranked points means you couldn't even do that. Now, I don't think Smooth has super impressive seasonal runs in the past, but what more than that, it really just comes down to Smooth was presented to me as a gambler. That is what Ice-T told me about this player. It's like, yeah, Smooth loves to take the gamble, and then that was presented to me in their play where they went for the Song Spinner over the Hextech Transmodulator. And when we're doing power rankings and we have this player that isn't coming in with seasonal topping experience, or at least not vast enough seasonal topping experience compared to even his countrymen is everyone else from EU coming in off of seasonal top fours, or at least has top four to seasonal before, as By Attack is a seasonal champion. It makes sense that I think Smooth is always going to be the lowest seeded player of the EMEA. You know, maybe you don't put him all the way down at 13, but I think that Smooth pretty much always going to be that low on the tier list when we compare him to the other EMEA competitors. And then, you know, nothing crazy coming out of the decks. The Varus Auction I think was a little bit spicy, but not like spicy enough for me to really move Smooth up. And again, it really just does come down to the fact that like this player was presented to me as a gambler, took the gamble on camera. I saw it with my own eyes, and I am someone who likes to play it safe. So Smooth, unfortunately, you got to be down this far. Coming in at number 12, Grandpa Roji. So Roji is, for those of you that don't know, I write before every seasonal a top 10 players to watch. And I've actually sort of internally banned Roji from my top 10 players to watch because Roji has, like many of the players so far, has not topped a seasonal. But Roji keeps going. You know, he'll get the 7-2, he'll get the 6-3. And what it really seems to me is, it seems like Roji kind of has to pick between having a good ranked ladder season and a good seasonal season. If I remember correctly, he's had a 7-2 in the past, or maybe even a couple, but it was in seasons where he didn't play the ranked ladder, so he didn't have the seeding. But more than that, what really puts Roji lower on this list for me is the fact that I have never seen Roji play anything other than mid-range. You know, we have the Akshan Sivir Varus. We know that Roji's like a big Akshan Sivir fan, a big Kaisa fan. Tillia Malphite, of course, one of his signature decks, but I would definitely classify Tillia Malphite as mid-range, especially the way that Roji builds it. And we know that he's a big Pantheon fan. Ultimately, I just haven't seen a lot of flexibility out of Roji over the last couple of years that he has been competing. Every time he comes in, he's coming in with these, just these solid mid-range decks. Now, to Roji's credit, he has done some pretty impressive things at the start of a season in an open meta, you know, when you're talking about the ladder, and he's able to just go, yeah, this is a good ladder deck, I'm going to run this. He's hit rank 1 multiple times, but I do think that the open tournament environment from a new set is a little bit different than the open ladder environment from a new set, and ultimately I'm just not sure how good Roji's read on metas has been. Was the Tillia Malphite a calculated pick, or was Roji just like, fuck it, I'm going to run back the Tillia Malphite? Now, I've been critical of Roji's pick of Tillia Malphite in the past, and in his credit, he doesn't always bring it. But the sort of metric that I've landed on is that if Tillia Ziggs is good, I'm fine with Roji bringing Tillia Malphite. With Roji never topping a seasonal, qualifying for Worlds with Tillia Malphite, there's a big question mark for me on whether or not he's going to run that back at the World Championship. And if Ziggs Tillia kind of falls off in the meta that we find ourselves in, it's possible that Tillia Malphite is going to be a little bit of a hindrance for Roji, and he's more here just to say, like, yes, I ran my signature deck at the World Championship, I topped 16 that, even though I've never topped a seasonal. It's a great storyline, but more than anything, I just cannot get past the fact that Roji is really stuck in his mid-range ways. There's not a lot of flexibility coming out of this player compared to everybody else. These are a lot of storied names on the list, players that have shown a lot of depth to their deck building, and Roji just putting himself in this box, I think, is going to be a little bit of a scary proposition for him if other players can find new and impressive decks, because Roji might not end up running any newer decks, right? I don't really see him clicking with like Rise or maybe Aatrox. It's kind of hard to tell. I haven't looked at the new cards too closely, but I think that there's a good chance that Roji, like if I had to pick someone on here to just run back their WCQ lineup, it's 100% probably Kicker A. But number 2 is Grandpa Roji. Because this is just the style of deck that he likes to play, and if the meta doesn't suit it, I imagine he's going to run back what he likes to run back anyway and might just get absolutely bodied for it. So I just really think the lack of flexibility here is something, this isn't really the time that I want to see Roji start to experiment either, right? Like, if he's been running off of it for these last few years and, like, it's been moderately successful, it got him this far, I'm just not sure how much further it can take him. Coming in at number 11, we have another player from the Americas, Maddie24 Mayo. Maddie's always been kind of a middle-of-the-pack player in my mind. Middle of the pack is the wrong way to put it, because Maddie's not like a 5 out of 10. right? Maddie's like a very solid 7.5 out of 10 is probably the best way to put it when I say like middle of the pack. But has a seasonal top this year, which is more than I can say for some of these seasonal point players. It was at the most recent seasonal with Nami, Twisted Fate, Akshan, Lee Sin, and Fiora Pantheon, and then totally switched it up coming into the WCQ with actually Spooky Karma and Conservatory, which were some decks that I did not think were going to have really any presence. Conservatory a little bit, but Spooky Karma came out of left field. And it's not even the traditional build of Spooky Karma that we saw for LW popularized rather recently with like Master Yi. Instead, it's Karma, Kindred, and Elise. There's even a Catalog of Regrets in here. So I do like that Maddie has a little bit more depth to their deck picking process, but for the most part, usually going to stick pretty meta. While Spooky Karma, not the flavor of control that I expected, just running SI control was something that was on a lot of players' radars. We have a lot of like Feel the Rush, Jace Heimer, things of that nature. Seraphine Shadow Owl, probably the most popular. And then the Conservatory list, nothing crazy here. It's just some good old fashioned Conservatory Riptide Rex. And I think Maddie has always been a pretty big fan of the Tibulk decks. So maybe that's something that he's going to break out again. But again, it's one of those things where I don't know much about Maddie's testing partners and group and who he kind of plays Legends of Runeterra with. I don't know if there's like a cracked deck builder waiting in his testing group, if there's anyone like significantly better than him in his testing group that can give him some pointers. Maddie is just a little bit of a player who has had kind of a mid-year, no real breakout performances, no like star-studded victories. You've only got the one seasonal top. But ultimately, I do think that Maddie is a very solid player. I just don't think that they're like a phenomenal player, right? I think they're a great player, but I do think that there are still steps above Maddie 24 Mayo for him to achieve. And once he reaches that potential, yeah, he can probably move up higher on the tier list. But when you come into a world championship as stacked as this is, I just think Maddie, definitely not one of the strongest players here. So yeah, just falling a little bit outside of the top 10, but Maddie's definitely someone that I'm going to be rooting for. I like this player. I've been following them for a long time. But ultimately, when it comes to just what I've seen out of his year, out of his career in Legends of Runeterra, I think that he doesn't really hold a candle to some of the names that we've got near the top of this list. Coming in, rounding out our top 10, not quite the top half, but the top 10 at the very least, we have Bois from EMEA. Now, Bois did get a seasonal top 4, and I went back and I watched some of the footage from that seasonal top 4, and there was one of the games that I was watching, like, Bois was in kind of a rough position, and I just wasn't really in love with the line that they took. They kind of like took the the safe line, but it was one of those like 2 safe lines where you're giving your opponent a little bit too much time. It was sort of one of those where you kind of have to push what you have here and just kind of hope they don't have it. And I don't think Bois was able to identify that kind of situation, which, like, again, this is just someone where I haven't seen their name in a lot of like community tournaments, so this footage from this seasonal is really the only sort of information that I can find on Bois, and what very limited information I have, not the most impressive. That said, from the qualifiers, I was, I think Bois played well enough, was pretty solid, obviously, as a seasonal top 4 under their belt. Pretty pedigreed player. France is a very strong region for Legends of Runeterra. I don't know how close he is with the other French players, if he's going to be testing with them, or who's, or what's, or whatever. But yeah, someone has to take the number 10 spot, and I think Bois is probably the player on this list that, like, I have the absolute least to say about. Not much to be said about their deck positions. Like, anyone who took Vayne PNZ and Red Gwen and then a third deck is just kind of like, okay, yeah, your lineup was whatever. Ziggs Talia, as I mentioned, a deck that might fall off for the qualifiers, but Bois, I think at the seasonal that they topped, I was watching them play Nasus, so definitely someone who's going to stick in the meta, be pretty above board, just based on what I know out of French CCG players. If I had to sort of stereotype Bois in that fashion, I'm not seeing a lot of like innovation come out of France, so I'm not expecting any like crazy new archetypes to be in Bois's arsenal. That's something I would expect more out of like Buy Attack and What Am I and those kinds of players. Like, there are players that are known for coming out with crazy decks and those that just kind of stick to their guns. Bois definitely someone who I think is going to stick to their guns and just play solid. Again, someone who might not have too many new cards coming out of the new expansion, might just kind of run it back, play it a little bit safe. But again, just a player that I really don't have too much to say about compared to some of the other names on this list. So we're getting into almost the top half. Coming in at number 9, we have FNP Chenia. And this is, for me, where things start to get a little bit more tough, where Chenia, I definitely think, could have moved up even like 2 or 3 spaces. So Chenia has been around pretty much since day 1. The first Legends of Runeterra event that I ever cast was this thing called the Korean Invitational in February of 2020. It was a bunch of like Hearthstone players and streamers and stuff like that from Korea that, LOR had pretty much just dropped. We were still in beta. If I remember correctly, Chenia played in that tournament, or at the very least played in a couple of the Korean tournaments that I would go on to cast over the course of 2020 while OGN was still around and running those. And Chenia has always been just a very good player. I don't think they have any like super major wins under their belt, and And one thing that I do want to talk about is the fact that Chenia is from South Korea. And last year, I thought that South Korea was one of the strongest regions for Legends of Runeterra. Now, back then, APAC was still divided into Southeast Asia and Asia, and the only Asia representative, the Asia server only being Japan and South Korea, that we had last year was Yamato. So there was no South Korea at the Legends of Runeterra World Championship previously. Now we have two players in Chenia and Reroll, and Chenia was actually able to take down Reroll in the upper bracket through this really weird grindy set that I'll get into a little bit later on when I actually get to Reroll on this list, because I have a lot more to say about Reroll side of things than Chenia's. But I do want to mention that right after, maybe a week after the WCQ, there was this Korean sort of like 16-man or maybe 8-man invitational that was played out, and Chenia again beat Reroll in the finals. So Chenia seems to have a leg up on his countryman, and I don't want you to look at this number 9 spot, say, oh, that's the bottom half of the list. Numbers 9 through 1 is where things kind of started to get hard for me. This part of the bracket was a little bit easier for me, but from here on up, things start to get difficult. But again, Chenia doesn't really have the pedigree that some of the other players up higher on this list do. While he's been invited to a lot of these Korean events, I don't believe he has a win. He might have won one of them. I actually can't remember. It's been so long since then. But Chenia has always managed to stay relevant, as you can see here, coming in off of seasonal points. But again, I think Chenia had 45, which is the same as Donut, so might not have even had a seasonal top, which is crazy, just the difference between the APAC and the Americas sort of discrepancies there. But Chenia is much more proven in the Korean tournament scene, you know, constantly getting invited to these big invitationals, picking up that win over Reroll at, I think it might have been like an Afrika Freaks sort of invitational thing. And Team FNP is the team that like JO1 is currently sitting on. So Chenia has some absolutely insane testing partners to help break the new set. Many people consider JO1 to be the best deck builder in the world for quite some time. Definitely someone who is very strong in open metas. So I think that Chenia, not only being a solid player, has a very strong support system behind him. And again, nothing crazy coming out of the decks here. Red Gwen, Vayne Kayn, and then Sivir Akshan Varus. So it's, you know, it's just like a Varus deck, a Kayn deck, a Gwen deck. Nothing too crazy, but I do think that Chenia is where we start to get into players that might have some absolutely crazy tech for the World Championship. And that can be kind of feast or famine, but for the most part, I have a lot of confidence in Chenia, and I do think it's a little bit of a shame that they are this low on the list. But, you know, again, this is an absolutely stacked top 8 that we've got ahead of us. So let's go ahead and get into that. So coming in at number 8, we are back to the Americas. I know that I've already gotten through 3 of their players. We've got Makis, What Am I, and Tankbuster left to be revealed, and the lowest of the top 8 to Tankbuster. So Prodigy DM'd me a little bit before the WCQ to kind of give me the lowdown on their testing group, you know, who was in it, the decks that they had, what meta thoughts went through their minds and things like that. And the name of the testing group, because I asked him, I was like, I'll just call you guys whatever I want. And he was like, call us the Tanks Busters. So Tankbuster was sort of the lead of that testing group that was really big on this Kaisa deck, as well as this Trundle Timelines deck. Now, Prodigy's been on Timelines for a few seasons at this point, and it's getting to the point where it's kind of hard to tell if Timelines was actually a good meta call, or if these guys have just been huffing Timelines copium for so long that they're incapable of playing a different deck. And, you know, Tank, just a solid player, quite a few not seasonal rather, but well, I mean a seasonal top 4, but I was going to say a couple of grassroots tournament wins under his belt, if I remember correctly, over the course of like maybe some Mastering Runeterras or some OLSs. It's really getting muddled in my mind on like who has won things and who hasn't, but Tank is definitely a player that I've written about before in the grassroots scene, and the fact that he's got a testing group behind him that seemed to have a very good idea of what they wanted to do in the qualifiers. Tank was able to execute on the plan. I think they unfortunately ran into like a couple of team kills along the way, and that's why Tank was the only one to make it through, because when a player does spearhead a testing group like Tank did, at least in name, and, you know, has like this really solid read on the meta, you can look at it one of two ways. You can look at like, yeah, you know, their prep really paid off. They actually did put someone through. Or you can look at it in another light of like, why didn't more of them make it through, right? If this testing was so good, why did only one of you make it into the top 16? I'm a little bit of both on this one. And I'm really curious how it's going to play out in a more open meta, just because, again, I think they had a very strong WCQ read, but you were going into a completely blind environment here. And based off of the names that I saw in the testing group, I didn't see anyone that like blows me away as like this innovative new set day one deck builder. But there are to quote Riot, about 200 years of tournament experience amongst Tank's testing group. So at the very least, whatever they bring is going to be very well thought out, very rigorously put through the ringer on what they at least expect the meta to look like. And again, I think Tank is someone who's going to go a little bit more on the anti-meta. They tend to play more for the level 2. So whatever level 1 ends up being, and that's kind of where things are going to get iffy, is like, is everyone on the same page about what level 1 even is? But Tank is a solid enough player that if given the right decks, I definitely think he can make it out of the group stage. Might be a little bit of an upset potential for some people depending on the group that he's in, because I have to go back and look at it. But again, at the end of this video, I will go through each group and give you my prediction on the 2 players that are going to make it out. So at that point, I will find out if I think Tank is an underdog for the group that he is in, or if I think that, he's just a guaranteed like number 1, number 2 coming out of that group. But yeah, Tank, very solid in pretty much every aspect. Coming into this, there's really not much that I can ask for out of Tank. It's just, are you going to get baited by what you think the level 1 is and try to level 2 it too hard, big brain it, whatever? So for the number 7 spot, I would say that you could definitely trade out Tank in this player, and that's Aragorn. So I think that like you could swap these two pretty freely, and I don't think anyone's gonna have anything to say about that really. But one of the things that I wanted to shout out here is that both these players, I believe, qualified through a top 8 on the Awakening seasonal. It's kind of hard to tell because the website's a little bit messed up. But one of the things that stands out to me about Aragorn is I talked about Tank Buster coming in with this really strong prep and like running Trundle timelines, and then Aragorn was the only player in EMEA to run Trundle timelines as well. So had that sort of read on the meta, a similar one to what Tank Buster did, qualified in a similar fashion. But then instead of going for the more traditional Red Gwen and then like the sort of off-the-wall Kaisa, we go for the more traditional Ziggs Talia and then the sort of off-the-wall Sundisk, because again, Aragorn was the only Sundisk player, not just in EMEA, but in the entire World Championship qualifier stage. And we knew that Control was going to be pretty popular. I didn't think it was going to be so popular that Aragorn was going to be able to come in with like this double Shurima Hourglass style of gameplay and the Trundle timeline. So again, Aragorn's just someone who had a very solid read on the WCQ meta, but not much is known about how they are going to perform in a more open environment that we're going to get out of the group stage. And I don't think players are allowed to change decks and lineups between groups in top 8. I'm not sure that it would even matter if they were able to. But again, I think of Aragorn kind of as the EMEA tank in this regard. I'm not sure who Aragorn's testing group is, if they've got some crazy hive mind going on back there. But Aragorn definitely impressed a little bit in the seasonal run from some of the gameplay that I got to see from them. They also had a little bit of a different take on the timelines. Tank, I believe, was playing like 2 Vi and then no other champions. And then we went for the Seraphine build on the side of Aragorn. Yeah. So Seraphine and Vi. So a little bit of a difference in opinion there on the players, but I do think that like the double Shurima was a good meta call. I don't think Aragorn can really run back their seasonal lineup, so I'm excited to see what comes out of this instead. But Aragorn is someone who I'm definitely excited to see, and like I said, very, very interchangeable within Tank Buster in my mind. We're getting to the top, right outside of the top 5. My number 6 player for the 2022 WCQ, Makis. So dropping the HDR tag, and this is something that I'm not sure how it's going to affect Makis coming into this, because a couple of the stronger minds from Team Hydra, which recently disbanded, were like Yang Zera, 4LW, who both recently signed with Mastering Runeterra, which is what Ami's team. So I don't know how many of Makis's sort of like standout testing group partners are still going to be testing with Makis, or if they moved over to helping out what Ami. But Makis, a little bit different than Grandpa Roji. So Makis, if you don't know, last year was 1 match win away from qualifying for 2021 World's Top 16 as well. Fell just shy in the final hour in the lower bracket. This time was able to make it through. Makis stands out to me as the thing that is most consistently interesting about Makis is they tend to, when a seasonal is coming up, Makis will win every single grassroots tournament you throw them into leading into the seasonal, and then usually fail to make the top cut of the seasonal. Now, I believe Makis did pick up a top this year, but one of the things that I want to talk about them versus Grandpa Roji is Makis is, like Roji, a little bit stuck in their ways in terms of the decks that they like to play. Makis is a very mid-range heavy player, Frostbite mid-range definitely being one of the decks that they played long past sort of its due, but Makis has another style of deck that they can pivot into, and that is Noxus Control. As we see here, Makis running the Conservatory, the Seraphine Ezreal Noxus build. Makis was a big Tri-Beam player, and the fact that they have a little bit of flexibility in what they want to one-trick, I actually think plays very well for them given how different the styles are, because if you can can one-trick mid-range and you can one-trick Noxus control, then I think that there are some new avenues that open up for you outside of that. There's not an insane amount of difference between like Noxus control and Shadow Isle control. I guess it kind of depends on exactly what the build is going for. But what I'm kind of getting at here is that when we look at Noxus control, in a lot of situations, you can still kind of play aggressively. Conservatory is a big example of this, where, you can still House Spider down your opponent. We're even seeing like Darken Ballista in the list from Makis. So yeah, I'm a little interested to see how this is going to play out, what kind of decks Makis wants to bring. If 4LW is still helping him prep as opposed to what am I, because I think 4LW could come up with some really interesting decks coming out of the Darken expansion. And ultimately, I'm very curious to see how Makis wants to handle this, because I think that either lineup that he ends up on, be it like mid-range or Noxus control or even a split of the two, we could see either one kind of succeed depending on what the meta is. And I trust Makis to make the right call on that one, or at least have the people around him make the right call. But the fact that Makis is on what I think many people consider to be one of the, if not the best Brazilian teams in all of Legends of Runeterra of all time, means that Makis has to be pretty high up on this list, right? Just the prep group that you have around them is absolutely insane. And Makis, very good at piloting the decks, definitely has his preferences, and I'm a little worried that he might get talked out of his preferences and be like, yeah, this deck is too cracked, like you have to go it. But at the end of the day, it is his call to make, and I'm hoping that he can kind of stick with his guns and go comfort, especially in a more open environment. And we have seen Makis do pretty well in seasonal open environments before. So I think that, coming into an unknown meta, Makis actually falls back on some pretty good comfort picks, I think is the way that I kind of want to phrase that and leave it at that. And then now we get into our top 5. My first player in the top 5, the 2022 top 16, Aurora. If you asked me who I thought was the most likely to make a comeback from 2021 Worlds to 2022 Worlds, I would have told you Pinpingho. Came in, immediately won a seasonal in APAC, followed that up with a second place, and was ultimately just dominating the APAC region. And I really thought Pinpingho was going to be able to come back into 2022 and redeem himself for kind of inting his lineup in the top 16 last year. Now, Aurora took second place in Pinpingho's victory for the seasonal, so had a second place under their belt, and then came around and decided to win a seasonal as well. So when we're talking about feats, Aurora has one of the most impressive years of anybody on this list, getting a second and first place at a seasonal tournament. And one other thing that I want to talk about is this Demacia Leona deck. Now, Leona's Shadow Isle was pretty popular in the qualifiers. Only 2 players across all 3 regions ran the Demacia variant. One of them was Aurora, the other one was the Cup Is Mine, who came very close to qualifying through the lower bracket and was one of my top 10 players to watch for the Americas WCQ. Now, that doesn't speak too much about just the success of Leona Demacia, but I think that the confidence to run this Demacia variant in a sort of field of more Shadow Isle minded people, was something that stood out to me. But ultimately, I really think like the feats just kind of speak for themselves. Aurora has been dominating the APAC server for a little bit now, and is definitely one of the players that is coming in with just a lot of pedigree behind them. And there's really not much to say beyond that, right? I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. We don't have a lot of players that can make consistent double final performances. You think of like Fresh Lobster is someone who's, I think, gotten a couple of second places. Kochua, Pinpingho. It takes a lot to get to 2 seasonals finals, even if you don't end up winning both of them per se. And ultimately, I'm very excited to watch more of Aurora play. Now that we've made it to the top 4, which is kind of its own sort of bracket, we have my number 1 APAC player, AFTV Reroll. So for those of you that don't know Reroll, they're actually the Monuments of Power Asia Seasonal Champion. But what really impressed me about Reroll in the qualifiers was how unfucking watchable the gameplay was, which, let me explain. So in the upper bracket, Reroll comes in against Chenia. Chenia is playing this mid-range style lineup. You can see here the Vayne Kane, the Silvervarus Auction, the Red Gwen, Reroll coming in with Nora, Elise Heimer, Swain MFTF, and Fielder Rush. Now, Reroll's strategy is to rope. And Reroll and Chenia play out 2 games over the course of 14 turns. It takes about 45 minutes. And, it's like 2 a.m. or like midnight or something. I'm watching this. Chat is like, yeah, I think he's just trying to rope out against the Vayne lineup and play the game in the last 5 minutes because he knows that his animations are going to be a little bit shorter or what have you. Everything works out. These players start game 3 in, maybe 5-6 minutes left on the clock. And with about 40 seconds left on the clock, Chenia is able to race it down and actually pick up the win, where Reroll was probably about a turn or 2 off of picking it up. But what really impresses me about this is just the depth of testing that Reroll went to decide that that was the optimal strategy. It reminds me of extremely nuanced sideboard testing in traditional card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering, where that's very low down on your list of priorities. And the fact that, one, you have a testing group that would even suggest something like that. And two, the fact that it usually means that you are very solid on every layer above it, which you just do not see a lot of players getting into that level of testing, of being so solid on, yes, these are the decks that I want to run. These are the ban strategies that I want to have. Okay, yeah, this is how I play this matchup, this, all the way down to, okay, yeah, I actually think that I can sort of cheese this one out by roping the first couple of turns, going to game 3, queuing up my FTR and full sending it. It's just a level of preparation that we are very unfamiliar with in the Legends of Runeterra space. And if Reroll is able to do that again and sort of get very solid on everything on top of it, it's more so almost like, who are you testing with that is coming up with these theories and deciding that, like, this is the optimal line of play? It was just something that I've never seen before in Legends of Runeterra, and really brought me back to my own competitive days in Force of Will, where the one that stood out to me was, like, we had this deck where, you know, we knew the meta, we knew whatever, and then we were like, oh shit, like, we can actually build this deck around going second because everybody wants to go first. Like, if we win the die roll, we say I'm going second. If they win the die roll, we say they say we're going second. So, like, we just get that 100% of the time. That is really what it took me back to. And the fact that Reroll is a seasonal champion on top of this, you know, definitely no slouch in their play. Definitely somebody that I am excited to see what their preparation for this event coming into it was and how it is going to pay off. And again, South Korea, I think, is just an extremely strong region. FNP and AFTV definitely being two of the more prolific teams over there. AFTV, of course, being a freak of freaks TV. So I'm expecting very big things out of Reroll. And the fact that, you know, they didn't defeat Chenia in that upper bracket. I don't even think they defeated Chenia in the tournament otherwise. But the fact that Reroll was able to make it that deep down the pool of testing is something that has stuck with me ever since the WCQ happened. So I want to start off by saying that I think the top 3 is pretty solid. Not a lot of room for debate on these ones, although I think there actually is room for debate between number 2 and number 1. But coming in at number 3 here, we have Buy Attack. And it's kind of a shame because the more pedigreed a player is, the less I feel like I need to defend them. You know, Buy Attack, a seasonal champion, top 16 from Worlds last year, one of only 2 returning players getting those back-to-back World Championship runs. But one of the things that stands out to me about Buy Attack is, if I remember correctly, they failed to make it to top 8. I think they just made top 16, or maybe they made top 8 and then fell out. But when we interviewed Baya during the EMEA WCQ, he mentioned that he was going to totally switch up his prep for this year, that, you know, he's very aware that whatever he did last year didn't work and needs to do it a little bit better. And that's something that can be hard to identify, right? You only get this one shot at things. So was it, okay, my prep was fine, but I didn't play well on the day? Or, like, did you prep poorly? And maybe with a new set dropping, Baya has some different players in mind to help him experiment and build up some decks. But again, it's just one of those things where, like, I feel so much like I don't need to defend Buy Attack in the top 3 that I unfortunately don't have that many nice things to say about him. I'm just kind of going to move on to our actual top 2, which I will now reveal at the exact same time, because once you know one, you know them both. Coming in at number 2, we have Teddy314, number 1, What Am I XX. And honestly, I think it is defensible to swap these if you wanted to have Teddy at number 1 instead of What Am I. I think that's, like, it's a take that I could see defended. But for those of you that haven't seen Teddy314 before, Teddy is the Seabiscuit of Legends of Runeterra, has completed the Triple Crown. Seasonal champion, EU Masters champion, and now, you know, looking to make themselves a world champion as well. Just getting to the top 16, I think, is enough to really solidify you as just, like, one of the best players in the game. And we talk about a lot for years about how Germany is just one of the strongest regions in EMEA with, like, Teddy, Smooth Swallowist, you know, one of the big ones, Sparkling Iced Tea, Fresh Lobster, of course. How could you forget him? And Teddy just, you know, absolutely dominating Legends of Runeterra right now, has shown that no matter what the format, he has a way to adapt to it. And I'm very excited to see what Teddy brings to the table. And then What Am I? Our number 1 player, going to be an America's player, which I'm pretty happy about. But What Am I? One of the only players alongside Buy Attack to return to the 2022 World Championship alongside the 2021, and doing it in spectacular fashion. What Am I is 8-0 lifetime in WCQ qualifier matches, went from upper bracket both years. And what stands out to me the most about What Am I is that What Am I is a deck builder. With this new expansion dropping, this is What Am I's ideal scenario. It hasn't won a seasonal yet, but that's fine. 2 back-to-back Worlds performances, that's got to count for something. And making it a lot further than any American last year, took 4th place at the World Championship in 2021. Absolutely no slouch. So yeah, I think that any power rankings that you're going to look at, like what am I, almost has to be number 1. I think maybe you could swap Teddy up there, but Baya, I think, kind of is gatekept by these 2 absolute monsters in the game right now. And yeah, those are my power rankings for 2022 Worlds. Let's talk about the groups. So the group stage is where things get a little bit dicey because it is just a round robin. You're only going to be playing 3 matches, or maybe it's double round robin. I don't even remember. The point is, only 2 players are going to make it out of each group. And the one thing that I've seen a little confusing, okay, so now Grandpa Roji's back in Group B. When I checked this website a couple days ago, What Am I was in this spot and Roji was in this spot, which was kind of confusing because What Am I and Donut had both come from the upper bracket in the Americas, so they weren't supposed to be able to be in the same one. So now that they are separated, I'm going to assume that this is the correct bracket. And so for predictions out of Group A, we have Tank, Bois, Teddy, and Aurora. Based on my power rankings, it's got to be Teddy and Aurora coming out of this one. Just like someone that dominates the APAC region, someone that dominates the EMEA region. Tank's prep is a little bit of an up in the air one, but I think Bois is really going to struggle to get out of this group. I think Tank has some upset potential, but it's definitely Aurora and Teddy for me. Coming into Group B, this is, I would say, the weakest group based on my power rankings at least, which is looking like Aragorn and Chenny are going to be able to make it out. But I don't know that this is really a group where Roji gets punished for sticking to his mid-range sensibilities. So I'm actually, while Aragorn and Chenny are the 2 that obviously stick out to me, Roji definitely has the upset potential here. Donut, unfortunately, I don't really think has what it takes to get out of groups. But again, Donut will shit talk me endlessly if I am wrong about that, so I'll give him the opportunity. Coming into Group C, Kaiser and Kicker A both in here. So Baya and Maddie, definitely my picks to make it out. I think Baya is as close to a sure thing as we're going to get to come out of a group stage, especially, having already been in this format before, understanding what needs to be done differently than the previous year. I think Baya is just far and ahead of easily the best player in Group C. And then if I had to pick a second player to come out, I mean, Maddie 24 Mayo is definitely who I want to see, but I think Kicker A has the upset potential here. Kaiser, sort of the weakest player in the group, in my opinion. And then in Group D, I mean, it's got to be What Am I, and it's got to be Reroll. I think the prep that these 2 players are going to come in is just going to be absolutely next level. And even though Makis is a little bit higher on my power rankings than Smooth, I actually think Smooth might be my upset player potential here. Because again, the reason Smooth was so low on the power rankings is because he's a gambler. And that is something that can or cannot pay off. I think Makis is the one that's going to struggle the most in this group. Coming in with like these safer Noxus Control or mid-range picks is not something that you can really do in a group with the level of testing that What Am I and Reroll are coming in with, as well as the unpredictability of Smooth Swallowist. I think Makis just didn't find themselves in a group that really kind of fits their play style. And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm predicting. We got What Am I and Reroll for D, Baya and Maddie for C, Chenia and Aragorn for B, and then Teddy and Aurora for A, with Tank with upset potential, Roji upset potential, Kicker A upset potential, and Smooth Swallowist upset potential. And those are my power rankings, my group stage predictions for the 2022 World Championship. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will have a little bit more content around Worlds. I'm probably going to be doing a co-stream, which I'll announce when follow me on Twitter at casterboulevard, and I'll announce it and tell you where it's going to be and stuff like that, who I'm doing it with. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Enjoy.